This handout is reserve requirements in the multiplier. You can take some time to read this if you need to. Hopefully you've already watched the notes over how we increase the money supply through bank deposits. So for this one, I'm going to work through it really quick, and then I'll do another one, another video with a practice handout so that you can see the different ways that this might be presented to you. Number one, it says if $1,000 is deposited in the bank, calculate how much the bank must hold in reserve for each of the following reserve requirements. And so what we're looking at here is if we deposit $1,000 and the bank has to keep 1%, that's going to be 1,000 times point, and remember we're moving it over two places, 0.01. And so when you put that in your calculator, it comes up to $10. So what that's saying is if the bank is required to keep 1% because that's the Federal Reserve has established 1% as the reserved requirement that they have to keep in the bank, everyone who deposits $1,000, the bank keeps $10 of that, and then they loan the rest of that out because that's how banks make money. They loan it out and they charge interest. So if they're required to keep 5%, you're going to take $1,000 times 0.05, and that gives you $50 that the bank has to keep in reserve of that $1,000 and the rest that they're going to loan out. If they have to keep 10%, 1,000 times 10%, which is 0.1, the bank would be required to keep $100. And if you kind of see a trend here, we're just moving basically the decimal over. If they have to keep 12.5%, that's $125. $150 is 15% of 1,000, and 250 is 25%. So this is how much the bank has to keep in reserve because the Federal Reserve has established this number. Right now, and typically it's 10% that the Fed requires, but they can manipulate this. If we need more money out in circulation, they're going to reduce this requirement, keep only $10, and the excess reserve they can loan out. If there's too much money out in circulation, they can increase the reserve requirement, tell the banks of that $1,000 they have to keep $250, and that takes money out of circulation. Sorry about that. So this next question, all it's doing is taking these numbers that you've done up here, the required reserve, and figuring how much excess reserve do we have left over that the banks get to loan out to other customers. So if we've calculated of this $1,000, the bank has to keep $10. Their excess reserves is $1,000 minus $10. So the bank can loan out $990. If it's 5%, they can loan out $950, and I'm just taking 1,000 minus 10 gives me $990. 1,000 minus the $50 that they have to keep in the bank, what's left over is the excess reserve. 1,000, we have to keep 100 of that in the bank. I have 900 left to loan out in excess reserves. If I have to keep 125 in the bank, my excess reserves is 875. If I have to keep 150 of the 1,000, 850 is my excess reserves. 250, I have $750 as my excess reserves. So what you need to understand is this person deposited $1,000. They loaned this out. Someone else took that, bought it, they put that money in the bank, so now that's in the bank. And then they're going to keep 10% of that, or in this case 1% of that, loan the rest out, and so each one of those is going to be in the bank. And so down here at the bottom, what we have is Eric deposits $1,000 with a 10% reserve requirement. The bank is required to keep $100, which means they have $900 in excess reserves that they are going to take. And Juan is taking a loan out. He goes to buy something. When he buys something for that $900, that $900 is taken and put in a bank. And we could say it was put in the same bank. And so now we have this deposit, and now we have a new deposit of $900. The bank is required to keep $90 of that, which means they have $810 in excess reserves. Latondra comes along and she takes out a loan for $810. She purchases something, she buys it, the store takes the money and then deposits that in the bank. So now we have this deposit, and this deposit. Once again, all starting from this $1,000. The bank has to keep 10% of that, which is $81. There's $729 in excess reserve. So that is going to be loaned out. Angie comes and borrows money. She purchases something. That store deposits that money potentially in the same bank. So now we have a new deposit of $729. They are required to keep $72.90, $656.10. Loan that out, deposit it, buy something, all of that in the same bank. 10% of that, 65, 61, and so we have this long drawn-out process if we went through this, but obviously there is a formula to calculate that, so we don't have to go through this whole entire process. And that's where we get the money multiplier. The money multiplier is 1 divided by the reserve requirement. Remember, the reserve requirement is a percentage, so if it's 10%, the bank is going to sorry about that. The Federal Reserve set the reserve requirement 10%, so the money multiplier in this example would be 1 divided by 10, or 10. This is a percentage, so make sure that you're putting your decimal place there. So I don't like the fact that this handout doesn't put the decimal place there. It doesn't matter when you're doing 10%, but it's going to matter when you use other numbers. So make sure that you know this is a percentage and put the appropriate number, because your answer is completely different if you don't do it correctly. So down here we're going to calculate the money multiplier. So that's the very first thing you have to do. So all we're going to take is put a 1 over each one of these. The multiplier, and this is how we're going to do this without going through that step-by-step process of keeping 10% at a time. So 1 divided by 0.01 gives you 100. 1 divided by 0.05 is 20. 1 divided by 10% is 10. 1 divided by 12.5% is 8. 1 divided by 0.15 is 6.67. And 1 divided by 0.25 is 4. This is the number here. Sorry about that. This number here is what you are going to take, and they call it the multiplier because that's exactly what you're going to do. You're going to take this number here and multiply it times the deposit that gives you the amount that could be created with each of these following reserve requirements. So if you have $1,000 and your reserve requirement is 1%, your multiplier is 100. So you're going to take your 1,000 times your multiplier, and with a 1% deposit, our total money that is created is 100,000. And if you want to be more accurate, you could subtract the 1,000 from that, so you can see exactly how much was created, because you have to get rid of that $1,000 because we didn't generate that. That was our original deposit. So 5%, we're going to take our 1,000 times our multiplier, which is 20. And that's going to tell us that we have generated or created $20,000 of new money based on that one deposit if the banks were required to keep 5%. If the banks are required to keep 10%, $1,000 times 10 is $10,000, so we created $10,000 in new money. Take your 1,000 times your 8, which is your multiplier for 12.5, and we've increased the money supply by 8,000. 1,000 times 6.67 is 6,670, and 1,000 times 4 is 4,000. So this is the multiplier. You have to do this step first. You're going to take the multiplier, multiply it times the deposit, and for each one of these different reserve requirements, you can see how much money is generated. So you can see what happens if we are in times of recession and we need to get more money out in circulation. The Federal Reserve is going to lower this reserve requirement. Instead of saying you have to keep 10,000 because we want to generate money in a recession, they're going to lower that to potentially 5%, so we can increase the amount of money that's out in circulation, get people spending money. In times of inflation, when there's too much money out in circulation and we want less money, then they would increase that reserve requirement and tell the banks you have to keep 25%, only being able to generate $4,000 to try and bring inflation down and bring the overall price of things down. So you've got two questions at the bottom, and these are extremely important. Why wouldn't we want unlimited growth in the money supply? If we have unlimited growth, we have too much money out in circulation. It pushes the price of everything up. That's what is inflation causes inflation, when the price of everything is going to go up. And then why don't we want zero growth in the money supply? Because that's when we have recessions and depressions. So we want money to be out in circulation. But the government and the Federal Reserve is constantly aware of how much money is out in circulation, what's happening to the overall price of everything. And this is one of the tools, one of many tools that they have at their disposal to help them regulate the amount of money that's out in circulation.